Brilliant. So Karen and I, as we said, have put this presentation together. I'm going to do the first little bit and then I'm going to hand over to Karen, but we, may well contribute to each other's bits as we go along. So Karen, do come in if there's things I miss or forget, or you think, you want to give an example or anything like that. So yeah, we're going to talk about demand avoidance today, which is sometimes known by other names. So up there on the slides we've got, it's sometimes known as pathological demand avoidance or extreme demand avoidance. There's some of the names that we sometimes hear when we're talking about this. It's an area that's a bit controversial, really. It's an area where there's still lots and lots of research and understanding going on to work out what we mean by demand avoidance. And it's something that we see in our neurodivergent young people, but also in lots and lots of other young people. It's something we all do to a certain extent. So, we all resist demands at times when life is feeling difficult. So,
snazzy one.
Could we just ask
sorry,
everyone
Charlotte, I'm
to
just
turn
going to
their
check.
microphones off?
Yeah.
Yep. Thank you. So what do we mean when we're talking about demands? So demands are anything that you are asked or expected to do. So they can be really explicit and obvious. So, I need you to put your shoes on, we're leaving the house, it's time for dinner. They can be much more implied. So knowing that, you've got something coming up in your diary that you're not looking forward to, knowing that there's a lesson at school happening that you find difficult. And there can be internal demands. So noticing what your body needs, so noticing you're tired and you need to go to bed, or noticing you're hungry. And demands, as we said, are something that we all have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, but we know that they often cause a high amount of anxiety, and we see a whole range of behaviours as a result of those demands. So we might see our young people giving excuses, of why they can't meet the demand, sometimes quite extravagant excuses at times, sometimes just refusal, unable to do it, either totally shutting down, not able to communicate, or physically resisting doing it. We might see distraction or trying to change the subjects, trying to move the spotlight onto something else. We may see those fight or flight responses, so not responding at all, running away from the situation, leaving the classroom, withdrawing, or being really physically aggressive. And I think what's important to remember there when we see those responses is that they are a young person who's in distress. So a question we get asked a lot as a diagnostic team is demand avoidance a medical diagnosis? And the answer is that no, it's not. So the way that we work as a diagnostic team is we have a manual of all the diagnostic labels that exist to give people. So everything is in there, and the criteria that a young person has to meet to be given a diagnostic label. And autism, ADHD, depression, anxiety, all those kind of things exist in these manuals. PDA, or demand avoidance, is not yet something that we have enough evidence to say is a thing in its own right, but we know that it is a description that can be a really helpful way of understanding someone's profile. So in order for something to be a standalone diagnosis, we have to be able to separate it out from other things. And one of the difficulties with demand avoidance is we see it not just in people who are autistic and have ADHD, but in so many other of our young people where they might have other challenges in their life as well. So we don't yet have the evidence to say this is a thing that's unique to neurodiversity, and we might never have that evidence. So as a service, we won't give demand avoidance as a diagnosis, but we do recognise that many autistic people struggle much more with demands than their peers, and it can be really helpful to just use that as a description within their report. So we may often say they have autism with a demand avoidant profile, and we'll explain what that means. the word, the idea of demand avoidance came about in the 80s. A lady called Elizabeth Newman, and at that time they really did think that PDA was kind of a separate bit of autism, a bit like Asperger's was felt to be like that. And that's quite an outdated view now. We know a lot more about autism, and we know a lot more about how high and low functioning labels are actually really not very helpful. And there was also an idea that autistic people didn't have empathy, and that's where demand avoidance came from. And again, those are really inaccurate views and not something we think of now. But there are pros and cons of using the descriptor of demand avoidance. We tend not to use the P bit of it because describing any young person as pathological has a lot of negative connotations, and so just describing demand avoidance or extreme demand avoidance tends to be more helpful. We need to remember that demand avoidance is driven by high levels of anxiety and a high need for autonomy and control. And understanding that about a young person can be really helpful. But sometimes people tell us that extra labels actually aren't helpful for them, and they make them feel more different from their peers. We also have other adults and young people who are able to tell us that being able to use demand avoidance is a really helpful way of explaining just how challenging life is for them. So it's something that we have to keep under review.
Charlotte, if I could just pop in here and say, the reason why the word pathological was used was to indicate that it's something somebody really can't help. So when I saw it in that light, it was quite helpful to understand it in that context. But yeah, I agree with Charlotte. We don't really like the word pathological, and you will have noticed if you go into the National Autistic Society website, they've also actually dropped the word pathological, and actually NICE guidance don't make any reference to it any longer either. So, but that's the reason why Elizabeth Newson did use the term pathological.
Absolutely, and I think within medical circles that these terms often have a different understanding to the day-to-day understanding of pathological, don't they? And that's really helpful, Karen, to to remind us of the medical understanding of pathological. But that's why we don't tend to use it when we're talking about this. So why is demand avoidance seen so much in our neurodivergent young people? And we know that for many of our autistic and neurodivergent young people, that everyday life has a lot of demands on them, that their environment is often harder for them to control. They're much more aware of their sensory environment, and they're much more easily triggered into an anxiety response from being oversensitive to what's going on in their environment. They often have a strong need for predictable routines, and demands generally disrupt those routines. Anything where we're transitioning from one activity to another involves demands. And one that's really big for many autistic young people is they might not inherently see the point in the activity we're asking them to do or have an interest in it. So that they have different drives for what activities they want to do and why. And if an activity is driven by kind of social norms and neurotypical norms, they might not see the point of it if we don't explain it. It's really fair to say that the research on demand avoidance is at a really early stage, and we're still working out what causes it. We think it's caused by both an anxiety about an event, so that's what we call anticipatory anxiety, so worrying about something that's coming in the future, and difficulties with tolerating uncertainty and predicting what things might look like. So many of those challenges that we know autistic individuals might have with imagination, which helps us predict what our future might be like, and be able to be flexible in thinking it could go more than one way, being able to what we call habituize, and that's learn that if it was like this last time, it's probably going to be similar this time. Those things are often challenges for our autistic individuals, and that means that you get a lot of anxiety before events about, I know this is going to be difficult and I really, really don't want to do it. But we also know that demand avoidance itself causes anxiety, because these young people want to do well, then they are aware that, you know, they're going to lose control, they're going to lose autonomy, and that's really, really difficult for them as well. So it can become quite a kind of self-perpetuating cycle, and that can make it really challenging for families and school staff and our young people to manage. Sorry, I'm just trying to move to the new page and I'm just having this. Oh, there we go. So one of the questions we get asked quite a lot is, you know, if we are looking at strategies to support demand avoidance, are we just encouraging these negative behaviours? Because on the surface, when you're looking at a young person who's just refusing, who's just saying no, it can feel like some of the strategies are just letting them have their own way. But that's not what we're doing. I think that's a really reductionist approach, and that really oversimplifies what is a very, very complicated difficulty. We know that these young children who struggle with demands are some of our most vulnerable group of neurodivergent individuals, and we want to teach them and to show them that things can go differently to the way that they perceive, and that we can be flexible too, and that things can change for the better. And I think the more we can do that, and the more times we do that, the more we're able to support them to move on from these difficulties with managing demands. There often are young people who've been labelled or misunderstood as naughty or disruptive. We know the outcomes for young people who are demand avoidant are really poor. So the earlier we can get in and support them to manage the demands, the better, really. And I think it's always helpful to remember, you'll have heard me say it before in the masking training, but it's exactly the same thing here, that, you know, our young people want to do well. They do well when they can. Nobody gets up in the morning wanting to go to school and have a horrible day. It's really challenging to work with these young people at times, but it can also be so rewarding when we can build those relationships with them and move this forward. So when we're thinking about demand avoidance, we do really need to think about the impact on the young person and the impact on the others around them. So evidence shows us that demand avoidance often impacts a young person in everything they need to do every day. So sleep is a really big area where we see lots of impact. So that might be going to bed at night, getting to sleep, staying asleep, getting up in the morning when you need to. We know that initiating self-care tasks is often a really big thing. So parents will tell us that, you know, trying to encourage the young person to have a shower, or to change their bedding, or to change their clothes can be really, really difficult. Getting them to stop what they're doing, to come down for meal times, those things can be difficult. Coping with the long-term effects of living in such an anxious and overwhelmed state is also going to be really difficult. So we're having, you know, really big periods of intense emotional distress and lots of panic attacks and difficulty regulating emotions. And that understandably impacts friendships and social relationships, as well as impacting, you know, their ability to attend in school and cope in lessons. And young people who have a demand avoidant profile are more likely to struggle with school attendance, and they're more likely to be out of education and training as well. It's also absolutely fair to say that working alongside these young people can be really demanding on you, and as school staff and as parents and carers of a young person who's demand avoidant, you will experience the impact of that. It's really distressing to witness a child that you care about showing so much emotional distress. Exhausting to try and be constantly having to find ways to reduce that distress, or think creatively or think flexibly, so that you can, you know, disguise and remove demands and support them through. And I think the stress and frustration of that is a really big thing for our families to have to manage, and for us, our staff working in schools, to have to manage as well. And I think there's also a stress and frustration that comes from it not being a very well understood area yet. So there is still myths about, you know, these are just naughty young people, they're just looking to get out of activities they don't want to do, they're just being oppositional, all of that. And we know for some families they will have been passed around between lots of services. You know, this is a mental health problem, this is a behavioural problem, this needs a diagnosis, this is all about parenting. All of those things also have a big impact on the people around the young person who are trying to support them. And in order to work well with demand avoidance, we really do need to have our own self-care looked after. So I think that's really, really important. So we've got some quotes here from some young people who are demand avoidant, have that profile. I think it's just helpful to have a think about what they say. So demand avoidance makes it sound like I'm avoiding things on purpose, but I literally have no choice in it whatsoever. So I prefer to call it demand anxiety. I really like that quote because I think, you know, it does really show that very, very often these young people want to do the activity, it just feels overwhelming. Sometimes I feel like I'm stuck in demand prison and I'm not allowed to enjoy a normal, let alone a happy life. I want to go to school, but I just can't. I hate it when people want me to do something, but for some reason I just can't. The more they try to make me, the worse it gets. So our young people tell us that this feeling of stuckness is often the biggest thing, and that can be really frustrating when you're trying to help them, because it's often every suggestion you give is met with a no or an I don't know, and that can feel really frustrating. But we have to hold in mind that it's as frustrating, if not more so, for them to feel that distressed and stuck. And we've got another quote here from a parent, you know, and parents often talk about how when you're parenting a young person with demand avoidance, it does feel like walking on eggshells. You'll see when we come on to look at the strategies in a minute that we talk a lot about needing to be flexible, to plan ahead, and all of that takes an awful lot of energy. But we do have to hold in mind you know, that the young person is also having to do all of those things. These young people are really prone to meltdowns, and I think it's important to remember that a meltdown is an intense response to an overwhelming situation, and it happens when someone's outside of their window of tolerance, when they've totally lost control. And within a meltdown, we see that fight, flight, freeze reaction. All of those reactions, whichever one you see, that is your body responding to the fact that it feels like it's an emergency and it's under threat. So we need to hold that in mind. So demand avoidant children, I think some of the reasons over the years there's been some misunderstanding around autism and demand avoidance is they can use some really creative ways to avoid demands. So there's some examples up there of some of the behaviours that we might see. So the verbal refusal of just saying no, physical refusal of, you know, putting my head down, not making eye contact, hoping that nobody notices me, nobody picks on me or asks me a question in class or anything like that. Or the more physical version of, you know, getting up and leaving, running away, fleeing from that challenging environment. Changing the subject is a really common one. So, you know, trying to bring the subject to something that they feel more comfortable talking about, hoping that you forget what the demand is that you've asked, or distracting you by being playful or inappropriate. They can be quite creative in kind of bringing in imagination and things like that sometimes. And I think that's why for a while there was considerations about whether this was a separate profile for autistic individuals who struggle with demands, because sometimes we don't see so much creativity in our autistic people in certain situations. And I think a really, really common one up here, particularly with our young people who struggle with demands and might struggle with attending school, is complaints of pain and illness. So, you know, I'm not well today, I can't go to school, is often a sign of that overwhelming anxiety about what's happening in the school day, rather than, you know, a physical illness. So when we see a child who's avoiding a demand, our first thought should always be curiosity. It should always be, you know, asking that question of why. And there's some, you know, some ideas up there about what might be going on for that young person. So is this a learning need? You know, have we asked something that's just too difficult for them? Do they understand what we've asked, and do they understand, you know, how to go about this? Or is it that we've asked them to, we've pitched it too high for their learning level, really? Is it about task initiation and attention? So our young people with ADHD often need a lot more processing time, and so we may see that kind of initial refusal or that difficulty with switching from one task to another, because they actually just haven't been given enough time to do that, and they need some support with that. Or as we said earlier, not seeing the point, so not seeing why I'm being asked to do this thing, why I'm being asked to stop something that's going really well and that I'm enjoying in doing to do something else. Anxiety about the task itself, and fear of failure or making a mistake. And I think also in that one, sometimes fear of praise as well. So anything that brings attention onto me can feel like an overwhelming demand. So, you know, am I going to get it wrong? Is the teacher going to make a point of pulling me up for my mistake, or are they actually going to praise me but in front of everyone? And that would feel really difficult as well. So actually I'm just not going to be able to start what I've been asked to do. Unmet sensory needs are a really, really big one. I think in our schools, particularly our secondary schools, where we're moving from class to class, and each classroom, each transition involves having to readjust to a different environment and cope with the sensory needs of a different classroom, a teacher whose voice is different, a seating plan that's different, you know, lighting, smells, all of those things that are different can get in the way of us being able to do that if that demand feels too big. SEMH needs as well. So, you know, for many of our young people, we know they've got those other needs around their emotional and mental health going on in the background. And as we said before, that anxiety of what if I lose control? You know, if I agree to this, if I do this thing that needs to be doing, I feel like I'm going to be out of control. I think it's really important at this point to take a minute to be aware of how we can all feel when a child or young person refuses to cooperate, when we ask them to do something that we think is really reasonable and that we've asked everyone else to do, and they just won't do it. And I think it's really helpful to be able to acknowledge how frustrating that can feel as the adult in the situation, and how we can quite quickly get feelings of, you know, of anger and frustration towards that young person, of kind of like, why is this so difficult now? Why did we do it yesterday and today we can't do it? You know, why are we in this situation again? And so I think we do need to be really self-aware of those feelings that we might have about being alongside a young person who's struggling with demands. And so I think we do need to be really curious about their behaviour. We need to try and hold in mind that they're doing the best that they can in that situation. We know that young people's learning is impacted when the environment around them doesn't cater for their individual characteristics or needs. And we know that often one of the best ways we can support our neurodivergent young people is by adapting that environment around them, and trying to make sure that we can personalise that as much as possible. We can change our approach when we're working with young people who are demand avoidant, and we're going to come on to look at some of the strategies for doing that now. So this slide has got a lot of words on, I realised when I was looking through them earlier, but Karen is going to start to go through some of these in a bit more detail in the next section. So I'm not going to go through everything on this slide. But the support strategies for demand avoidance, a bit like our understanding of demand avoidance, are still evolving, and some of them do have a limited evidence base at the moment. So what we've tried to do for you guys is pull together the best evidenced ones that we have at the moment, whilst being aware that these things may change. So, where we can, we want to reduce or remove demands, and that's not always possible. There will be some demands that are lines in the sand, and they're about keeping everybody safe, and they have to happen. But there will be other demands in school and in day-to-day life that we probably can let go. And I think working collaboratively with our young people to look at that can be really, really helpful. We're going to look a bit how we can change our communication style, so that we're using more curious and indirect communication, and we're offering our young people chances to opt in rather than putting demands onto them. And we're going to look at how we can cope, when young people are in that very stressed state, how we can adapt our own eye contact, body language and things like that to try and support them. And as we've got at the bottom there, Somerset, we promote the SERTS approach, so social communication, emotional regulation and transactional support. And that is a tool that is very much about individualizing for each young person what strategies around social communication, emotional regulation and transactional support help them to manage their energy and emotional regulation levels and feel more in control of things. So SERTS works really well in supporting young people who struggle with demands. Okay. So at the heart of the process of supporting young people with difficulties with demands is about us working with them to think about kind of what can we compromise on, what do we have to prioritize as the things that have to happen, how flexible can we be, and where is that negotiation. So that's where we need to start. And so, that's just a list of some of the demands that we might see in a school day for a young person. And as you can see, when you look at that, there's some that you think they are vitally important, they absolutely have to happen. And there's others where we can think, actually, some of these demands we could easily make a reasonable adjustment that helps the young person to feel a bit more in control and that makes it a little bit easier for them. And Karen, I think I'm handing over to you now for the rest of the slides. You'll just need to let me know when you want me to flip it onto the next slide for you.
Okie dokie. I think you're going to do 2 more slides, but I can talk to these, I'm sure.
Oh, so okay, that's my mistake. I can do
the
next 2 if you want me to.
No, it's okay. But do chip in, likewise, chip in if you think there's anything that you want to say as well. Yeah, so I hope you found what we've shared with you so far helpful. It is, as I just want to reiterate a bit, that there's a lot of research going on at the moment around demand avoidance. We obviously need to do a lot more research. But it's about, I think what I'd like to say at this point, and I'm going to say it at the end again, is that whatever we do to support children with demand avoidance is actually really helpful and useful for all children in the classroom. So it's really just kind of thinking and adapting how we work with children in the classroom. And, it's kind of maybe moving away from this a very behaviorist approach that we as teaching staff, it's so ingrained in us to always think about, working with children and people around consequences and telling them that when they need to do something and making sure there are very firm boundaries, etc., etc. And I think when we're talking about demand avoidance, we are saying, let's be a little bit more flexible. Let's think about neuroaffirmative environments so that we can cater for everybody. And actually, all these ideas and strategies are actually helpful for all children and young people. So the first thing is really to kind of think about tolerance, and obviously that varies from person to person, and therefore you need to kind of vary your own tolerance level towards the young person, but you need to understand the young person's tolerance to what can they kind of respond to when certain demands are being made on them. So always be guided by the child's emotional state. Consider where are they at that particular moment. I'm going to talk a lot more about that in a little while. Synchronize your demands with the child's tolerance levels. Make sure that they kind of meet up, so you don't get into a process where things escalate very fast. And aim to enable the child to feel calm, safe and regulated. And I can tell you, I'm going going to share a little an experience with you of a boy that I'm going to call Charlie, who I was asked to go and see in a school quite some time ago. And this was not in Somerset, it was in a different local authority. And I went along, and he was in the classroom, and he was busy completing an essay on the Titanic. And the teaching staff, they had informed me that he can be very demand avoidant and just high levels of refusal, etc. But what I can tell you is that I actually discovered his teaching assistant was incredibly intuitive and very skilled in managing that. And it was very instinctive to her, but she was absolutely brilliant with him. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about Charlie as we go through the next few slides. So next slide, please, Charlotte. Okay, so this is where I was going to start. So the 5 helpful ideas in supporting a person who's struggling with demand avoidance. I want to tell you, this is not something that Charlotte and I've thought up. It's on the National Autistic Society website. It's what they really promote when you're dealing with somebody who is demand avoidant. And what I'm going to say to you now is this works for all children, really. I'm a mum of a 17-year-old, and I often think of these 5 strategies when I have to kind of, in terms of parenting a teenager. So really, this is nothing new. You probably know a lot of this already, but this is particularly important for those children, young people who do have that profile of being demand avoidant, and particularly when they're in a very anxious state. So the first thing is always to think ahead and plan and think ahead. When you have a young person in the classroom, and particularly if they have a particular TA supporting them. So with Charlie, this is where his TA was absolutely brilliant. She would look through lesson plans and she would think about what was going to happen in the next few days and discuss with the teacher what the best plan of action would be to keep Charlie engaged in his learning. So kind of just being very, very aware of his needs and what he might find really, really difficult. Give advance notice to. Now, I think anybody who's worked with children and people who are neurodivergent will know that this is one of the most important strategies we always suggest to everybody is remember, particularly children with ADHD, they need that advance notice. Children with autism, they need to know what's coming up next. They really struggle with kind of that level of sometimes spontaneity that we do in teaching. So it's important to kind of consider and plan well. Neurodivergent people, they take longer to process new things, so they need a bit more time as well, and particularly when there are going to be changes to the timetable, or supply teachers coming in the next day. And even if it's something that you can't help, like teachers off sickness, supply teachers coming in the same day, it's just making sure people are given a little bit of notice or being told that this is happening and why it's happening, and giving them space to actually process that information. Monitor stress levels and adjust demands. So I think this is just a very good life skill to have generally, is sometimes it's also monitoring our own stress levels. And we know that, as Charlotte's already mentioned, people who are demand avoidant can actually push our buttons sometimes, and just having that self-awareness. And if you have a personality like I have, which can be quite reactive at times, is to have that self-awareness and think about what do I do when I can feel that happening, in terms of how we respond to it. But it's also about monitoring the child or young person's stress levels and where they're at, and adjust the demands you make on them in that particular moment. As I said, this is just a really good life skill to have, because this doesn't just come up with children and young people who have a demand avoidant profile. This is something that is actually happens in life generally. But with our children who are demand avoidant, think about the activities which fill and empty their stress bucket. So think about if actually, it's getting quite high now, we need to stop doing something, and think about a different activity you can do that is going to make them feel a bit more relaxed. Make sure if there've been lots and lots of demands in that day or week, that you build in time for activities which can replenish their energy levels. That's really important. Space is also very, very important. If you can see that a child or young person is beginning to feel overwhelmed, make sure there's a space that they can go to. And often using sensory items can be very soothing. for that child to help them kind of regulate, either co-regulate or self-regulate. So, you know, it's important to kind of understand their sensory needs in relation to demand avoidance, because they often go hand in hand. And then the last one is the keep calm. Sometimes really, really hard, but it's about practicing, again, as I say, that self-awareness of actually in this situation, it's better just to stay calm and to take a step backwards and sometimes allow the space for regulation to take place. To give you a different example, I was working with a teacher who was incredibly skilled. She was brilliant, really, really skilled teacher, very, very high knowledge of neurodiversity and particularly autism. But she acknowledged that she had a difficult dynamic with a young person who she was teaching, who would actually push her buttons to such an extent that she became very anxious herself. So and that often was in situations where he would potentially kind of engage in something that could be harmful. So instead of staying calm and stepping back and giving space, she would start talking to him quite excessively. And the more she spoke, the more dysregulated he became. And I think that, you know, is something that she needed to kind of explore with herself and have self-awareness around, because neurodivergent people really, really struggle to process verbal information, particularly when they're feeling overwhelmed. Okay, next slide, please. So, right, so yeah, and so a few other things. Build trust. I mean, this is a relational approach. I think a lot of you have been to various training sessions on a relational policy, and it is about using humor, curiosity, unconditional positive regard. Just building a good relationship with a child or young person can help, you know, them manage demands better, or help you think about what are the kind of demands we can put on our children and young people, or how can we present them in a different way that they don't feel like a demand to that child or young person. There's a link in these slides to the NEST approach, or you could just Google it. It's got some really, really lovely ideas and resources to help, and also, you know, use all that relational policy stuff that you've already got in your toolkits. Adjust expectations and priorities. I think Charlotte touched on that as well. It's just about making sure that, you know, we don't sweat the small stuff, as we sometimes say. So another example I want to give you here, this was a very long time ago. This is probably back in 2004 and 5. I'm letting you know how old I am now. But I went into a school to see a young lady. She was in year 5, and they were really, really struggling to support her. And I arrived in the classroom, and the head teacher of the school was sitting next to her. I will also say that the school was in an required to improve Ofsted category, but the head was sitting next to her and saying to her she couldn't use this particular eraser rubber that she wanted to use because he thought somebody else needed to use it, and she needed to learn that she couldn't hang on to this particular eraser. So I was in the classroom for about 10-15 minutes observing this negotiation debate going on between the head and the young person. And eventually I just felt I had to intervene, because the children around this child were saying, it's okay, she can keep that rubber, we don't mind, there's a whole basket full of them that we can use other ones. And I then did just go and pick up another rubber, gave it to the child next to her, to whom the head teacher was trying to get this young person to hand the rubber over to the child next to her. And of course, you know, yeah, he did feel a bit undermined by me. We had a long conversation about it afterwards. And my message to him was, actually, that was a situation that was never going to be resolved. It just completely escalated. And we didn't really, you know, the children, they understood, and they didn't mind her actually hanging on to that particular rubber, because obviously something about that particular eraser made her feel safe. So it is about really thinking about, you know, the flexibility, what can you let go of and what can't you let go of. So it's not okay to let a child run across a road, or a child making the decision to run across a road, but how can you change that demand that you can't run across a road into a situation where they feel in control that they are making the right decision. And that's often how you have to work with demand avoidant children and young people, is to kind of ask a question and help them so they make the best decision for themselves and think that they've made the right decision, rather than having been told to do something that then kind of makes them feel out of control. Okay, so other rules and expectations, it's really about being as flexible as you possibly can be, and offer simple choices. Sometimes it's about which pencil are you going to use to do the writing activity. So basically you're saying the writing activity is not an option, it's not negotiable, you have to do that, but you can choose what kind of pen you use. We can be flexible about that. And then it's also very important sometimes to explain and definitely depersonalize rules. Where our sort of, making demands very personal is where you'll often get that backup reaction, and the child, young person doesn't want to do something. So depersonalizing them is really, really important. And particularly with children with ADHD, will often, not do things just because they are socially expected. If you explain to them why, it becomes easier to consider. You can go to the next slide. So think about praise and punishment as well. I think, again, Charlotte did touch on that. It's really interesting that neurodiverse and children, young people often struggle with praise, because it puts them in the spotlight, as has already been mentioned. It can also put sort of pressure on them if they're doing really well at that particular thing, that they feel pressurized that they're always going to have to do particularly well. So revert to indirect praise. You could perhaps be talking about that child or young person in their earshot to somebody else to say how proud you are of them. Perhaps also sort of offering tangible and spontaneous rewards, rather than saying if you do something you can be rewarded. If you notice that they've done something really well, offer a reward of something that they really, really like, and actually empties their stress bucket on the spot. And sometimes natural consequences. So rather than getting really cross with the child because they haven't done their maths homework, sometimes we don't know the background or the circumstances around that. Just say, oh dear, I see you haven't done the homework. Let's sit down together now and do it together at the start of the lesson, or we can do it at the beginning of the break, or whenever. But depersonalize it. Don't make them feel that it's their fault in that particular situation. Find a solution. Be solution focused about it. And then praising the results rather than the young person. Again, so they're not individually in the spotlight, but basically saying, oh, this English essay is brilliant with excellent descriptors and worthy of a top mark. So you're actually describing what they did well, rather than kind of putting them again in the spotlight. So invitations to opt and learn. I think we've touched on this already. It's keeping things light-hearted, playful and fun. Adjust your language to be descriptive and not always questioning. Model things yourself, really, really important. And use the young person's interests, also very important. Changing language. This is something that you can kind of practice and learn. So, and this is Charlie's teaching assistant, this young person who I saw who was writing the essay on the Titanic and was absolutely brilliant. It was really interesting because I was asked to do a cognitive assessment on him, and I didn't really want to, but if the school really felt important for me to do that, I would. And so my way of dealing with the situation was first to kind of get to know him a little bit. I went and sat next to him. I asked him first, could I come and sit next to him at his desk? And he said yes. And I asked him what was he doing, and he was really writing this brilliant essay on the Titanic. And I then invited him to come and join me to do these activities. And within the first sort of 5 or 10 minutes of carrying out the assessment, and cognitive assessments are highly demanding activities. You've got a stopwatch, you're telling kids what to do, they know they're being timed. It's very overwhelming, it's a very anxiety-provoking kind of task. And I was in a room that was carpeted, but after 5 or 10 minutes, my kit got thrown all over the room. Every single chair in the room was on its side. And I just looked at him and I said, oh, I can see this is really, really hard for you. And I said, shall we go back to the classroom? Do you think that's a good idea? And he kind of nodded. So I took him back to the classroom, explained to the TA what happened. I went back to the room and sort of making my notes and sort of thinking about what next I could do in terms of my assessment. And the TA arrived back with Charlie, and she said he simply asked her, could he come back to speak to me? She had not, suggested that he should. It was completely his own choice. And he basically said to me, I'm sorry, I made such a mess in the room. And I just said to him, so what do you think? What do you think needs to happen next? What do you think we should do now? And he said, I guess we need to tidy the room up. And I said, I think that's a really good idea. And I said, would you mind doing that for me? And he said, no. And off he went and he tidied everything back and put everything back in its place. And it just shows you, that was just such a lovely example of how the demand of the cognitive assessment was too big for him, but he actually did feel the remorse of what happened and wanted to make it right. And I think, and if you can think about some of the language I used, I didn't say to him, you need to make this right, you must do this. I didn't reprimand him because he did what he did. But it is about having that sort of curiosity and saying, I wonder if we can, let's see if we can make something. I can't see how to make this work. Can you? Shall we see if we can beat the clock together, etc., etc. So it's really just thinking about the kind of language we're using with our children and young people. And the beauty of this is this kind of works with all children and young people, not just neurodivergent children and young people. And it's kind of helps. This sort of also helps them to develop their sort of self-confidence. As well, because they feel in control of the decisions that are being made. I mean, this slide is really just about thinking about imperative language, so kind of using questioning language rather than sort of direct demand language, and sometimes thinking about how can we shift and change how we are communicating with our children and young people in general. Next slide. Okay, so kind of thinking about declarative sort of language. So I'm wondering if you've understood what I've said. I've just noticed it's nearly lunchtime. I remember this happened before, and we did. I've put some Lego out and some paints over there. So you're not telling them what they need to do, but you're kind of preempting a situation, and you're helping them make the best decision they can in what needs to happen next. I'm finding this book really interesting. Wow, this math problem is hard. I wonder if you'd like to help me, and maybe we could walk a different route today or a different way, etc. So it's just really shifting our language. Next slide. Okay. Right, so rules are often more tolerable if for young people if they are attributed to someone rather than themselves. So, child wants to go to the playground. There's a rule in the school: the child cannot go to the playground without an adult. So, how can we respond to that? We can either say, "Thank you for letting me know. Make sure Miss Thompson, the TA, doesn't get left behind. She'll come with you," or if they can't go to the playground in that particular moment, is to explain why they can't and offer them a different activity. Would you like to carry on with your maths or your history project instead? So again, going to the playground isn't negotiable. It's just not going to happen because you can't go for health and safety reasons. But this, I'm giving you an option here of you can do either this or you can do that. So these sorts of options actually work really well with our demand avoidant children and young people. Next slide. Okay, activities in a one-to-one session. I'm not going to go into these into detail because this is something all our else's know really well and do really well already. But some examples there of when you're working in a one-to-one sessions, and particularly people like our else's. Okay, prevention is best. So it's going back to what we said right in the beginning. Notice the signs of stress. You know, when you can see that refusal starting to bubble, when the young person walks out, head down, tearing up work, being silly, etc. And at these times, offer choices, observe and suggest, wonder out aloud. I wonder if this history topic is just, you know, too boring for you. I wonder if it's too hard for you to understand. I wonder if we should do this instead. You know, talking about meltdowns, yeah, you know, we've spoken about that. It's due to feeling overwhelmed. And, you know, when we've spoken to young people about how they would like to refer to them, they always say, please don't call it a tantrum, call it a panic attack or an anxiety attack. And in these situations, support and de-escalate. You know, de-escalation is key. That's what we really have to do. And a very, very, very big point here is don't take it personally. It's really important to depersonalize when children and people respond out of, you know, kind of become so dysregulated because they just cannot kind of deal with the demand being put on them. Don't take it personally. Next slide. So I love this parent quote here. The biggest thing I would say to anybody about demand avoidance is keep calm. If you get stressed and are getting more anxious, the whole thing is like igniting dynamite. You just need to keep it calm. So the key issue here is personal, is kind of maintaining a non-threatening stance and allowing personal space. Being aware of that paraverbal cues, as I mentioned, the example of the teacher who, when the young person became anxious and dysregulated and could potentially harm somebody, then that teacher became more anxious, and she just started speaking so much, so fast, volume went up, and, you know, so it's kind of really developing that understanding of your own self-awareness of how you respond in these situations. Don't rush to interact. Make it clear you've got time, and that so do they, to calm down as well. Yeah, reduce the verbal input, allow silences. As I've said before, neurodivergent people often really struggle to process a lot of verbal information. Distract with something that is interest-based, suggest somewhere else to go, and allow recovery time, safe space where they can have sensory input, soothing activities, etc. So in summary, just a very quick summary, be prepared. That's kind of, you know, think ahead, be flexible, don't sweat the small stuff, be indirect, don't put these children and people in the spotlight, pick your battles. You know, think about where you can be flexible, what is where you can kind of be negotiable and where you can't. And tune into the anxiety and panic which underlies the child's behaviour. Understand where it's coming from, kind of understand what's happening and support to calm down. And as I said at the beginning, I'm going to just reiterate that these strategies are not new to many of you. You're already using a lot of this in your schools because they work for all children and people. But these are the kind of strategies that form part of what we would call neuroaffirmative environments. And our next session on the 12th of June is going to be on understanding and how we can create neuroaffirmative classrooms. So that is, I think, is there one more slide? I think, was that it? Yeah, I thought there was one more slide, and that's the fact that we do have a demand avoidant policy in Somerset. It's I think if that is, yeah, so it's on in the chat. You can see, and there are also a set of strategies that basically summarises this presentation we've just done, that goes alongside our Somerset demand avoidant kind of position statement. Okay, I think that's it, and I think I'm going to ask Faye to stop the recording.